Director here at the Peters Township Public Library. Welcome to everyone on both floors. This is wonderful. The Library of America awarded Peters Township Public Library funding for public programming to mark the 100th anniversary of the nation's entry into the Great War in 1917. The Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History awarded the library a national traveling exhibit, which you see behind me, which explores the transformative impact of World War I. So this evening, we welcome you to our opening event. We extend our gratitude and appreciation to our World War I and America partners, VFW Memorial Park Post 764, represented this evening by Quartermaster Michael Flower. We also thanks also goes to Reverend Benjamin Wright, board member of the Veterans Breakfast Club, who is representing another partner, the Veterans Breakfast Club. Pastino, Executive Director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, is the veteran liaison for the World War I in America commemorative programs at our library. We also extend a welcome to our performers and presenters this evening. Enjoy a musical trip through history presented by Valerie Williams with the Abbey Players, accompanied by Jess Kimball. This musical presentation has been conceived and directed by Val Williams with additional direction by Nicole Tafe and Nora Brannen. And from our guest presenter, Michael Neiberg, we will learn this evening about the Great War. Professor Neiberg is an author and one of the distinguished World War I scholars contributing to the collection of both printed materials and visuals that are created as part of this Library of America National Project. In his introduction of Michael Neiberg, Reverend Benjamin Wright will share more information about him. And following Professor Neiberg's presentation, Professor Neiberg will open the Gilder exhibit, which will run through August the 24th. And the Gilder exhibit will be here. If you don't get to see it this evening, we will have it throughout the library for the rest of the month. And along with the Gilder traveling exhibit, we have other exhibits planned for this evening. So we ask that you visit our second floor. We have a grand staircase, and we also have an elevator to your right to meet our local exhibitors who are sharing their World War I memorabilia. We also acquired limited rights to share a collection of images of World War I posters that were from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum collection. And that's what you saw out front. So if you didn't get a chance to really get close to them, have your picture taken beside them. They're on both sides, but those are actual posters from World War I that were reproduced for this event. We also want you to know that following the opening of our exhibits, Valerie Williams and the Abbey Players will move to the second floor and entertain you with more World War I era songs. And Jess Kimball will be at the grand piano in our reading room, so we're having to sing along. So we have song sheets for you, so as you have refreshments, you can enjoy the singing upstairs. The refreshments are provided by our Library Foundation, along with the Friends of the Library, who contributed cookies and lemonade. And we invite you to remain at the library and view our exhibits, listen to the World War I era music, and perhaps engage in a sing-along. For those staying at the library, Sue Miller, our Assistant Director, George Dvorak, and Reverend Wright will be upstairs accepting reservations for our World War I programs that begin August the 20th. We will be having World War I book and film discussions led by Carnegie Mellon University Professor David Shumway. Those are limited to 30 people only, so if you are interested, we have a television up there and a big screen that can help you get the reading materials for those and the DVDs to check out. And Todd DiPastino will facilitate a panel discussion, and those panelists include George Dvorak, who's a Vietnam veteran, retired Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Wright, also a Vietnam veteran, Army helicopter pilot Sarah Bryant, who served in Afghanistan, and Army infantry member Nick Grimes, who also served in Afghanistan. So those folks will be part of our panel discussion. So we of course invite you to attend those events August the 24th and November the 2nd. So move on now to what's next. Valerie Williams is a professional singer whose creative work encompasses performance, direction, choreography, and arts education. She's a graduate of Peters Township High School, and Val is honored to be performing in her hometown and bringing this important program to life. As a performer, Val has been seen on Broadway, off-Broadway stages with the Irish Repertory Theater Company, Musicals Tonight, Theater Works USA, Inside Broadway, with numerous bands and cabaret shows. Val is currently on faculty at the Lincoln Park Performing Arts Center, where she recently directed The Jungle Book, Kids, and Seussical Jr. with the Henry Mancini Academy. Val also teaches with PA Cyber and Artreach, and as a teaching artist has worked with students in 19 states. Val is also a passionate advocate of music and arts-based therapies, so working with Sing for Your Seniors and multiple VA hospitals. So I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Valerie Williams and the Abbey Players.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to kick off this evening's program with, of course, none other than the Star Spangled Banner, sung by the Abbey Players. Thank you, Abbey Players. The year was 1914, and the Great War had begun. But as Austria-Hungary invaded Russia, the United States had other pursuits. After all, we were busy at home. So President Wilson, Congress, and the prevailing sentiment of the American public was to remain neutral. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The Ford Model T was rolling off the assembly line at this point every 3 minutes. And immigrants were pouring through Ellis Island at the rate of up to 10,000 a day, more than the center had or would ever see again. In fact, the United States was so busy growing that it had yet to even adopt an official national anthem. That song you just heard did not become the official national anthem of the United States of America until 1931. But in 1916, President Wilson declared it an official song of many branches of the armed forces and other organizations. And as 1917 approached, there is no doubt that the immortal words that Sir Francis Scott Key penned during the War of 1812 would have an important and lasting impact as the United States was poised to enter what would come to be known as the Great War. But in the early days, the United States decided that it didn't want to enter World War I. It decided to remain neutral, as the 1915 hit by vaudeville comedian Bert Williams proudly declared. "I'm neutral," he said. Congress agreed, as did the American public. And lighthearted, carefree entertainers, from sea to shining sea, declared the same. I love a piano. love to hear somebody play upon a piano, a grand piano. It simply carries me away. I know a fine way to treat a Steinway. I love to run my fingers o'er the keys, the ivories, and with the pedal I love to meddle. Not only music from Broadway, but I'm delighted when I'm invited to hear a long-haired genius play. So you can keep your fiddle and your bow. Give me a P-I-A-N-O-O-O. I love to stop right beside an upright. Oh, a high tone, baby grand. What do you think? You love a piano? He doesn't care for him. More of a trombone man, this one. I love a piano. I love a piano. I love to hear somebody play upon a piano, a grand piano. It simply carries me away. I know a fine way to treat a Steinway. I love to run my fingers over the keys, the ivories, and with the pedal I love to meddle. Not only music from Broadway, but I'm delighted when I'm invited to hear a long-haired genius play. So you can keep your fiddle and your bow. Give me a P-I-A-N-O-O-O. I love to stop right beside an upright or a high tone, baby grand. Woo! Now that 1915 hit was written by Tin Pan Alley extraordinaire Irving Berlin and called, of course, I Love a Piano. Irving Berlin was himself an immigrant, a Russian immigrant who came to America in 1893 at age 5 through Ellis Island in search of a better life. As a young boy, he turned to songwriting to make ends meet. Somehow it worked for him. I always find that one amusing. He turned to songwriting to make ends meet. Okay. But it worked, and he quickly was snatched up by the Manhattan district known as Tin Pan Alley. Anyone have ever heard of that? Right. So Tin Pan Alley got its name by the relentless banging of keys that could be heard wafting out through the windows of the district onto the streets of Manhattan. And Irving Berlin certainly made his mark there. Now, there's no question that the music that came from Tin Pan Alley is uniquely American, as is the music of Irving Berlin, a Russian immigrant. So here to present one of his most singable songs that was actually written in 1911, but no doubt echoing through during the years of the Great War, are the Abbey Players with Alexander's Ragtime Band.
Wanna hear
years, he had worked his way up, from joining them in 1907 as just a staff lyricist, writing countless lyric after lyric for other people's melodies, which he would no doubt very unlikely be credited for, to becoming one of the partners of the firm. And in 1917, he and his firm churned out this highly memorable hit, Me and My Gal, which would later, of course, become very famous when Judy Garland performed it on screen. So here are two of our Abbey Players to perform Me and My Gal, Nick and Mariah.
What a beautiful day for a wedding in May. See the people all stare at the lovable pair. She's a vision of joy. He's the luckiest boy in this wedding array. Hear him smilingly say,
Anyone familiar with them? You're a pretty history-savvy group here this evening, so I would imagine you were. Vaudeville evolved out of the popular European music hall tradition, and vaudeville was the most popular form of American entertainment from about 1880 to the 1930s. It was the precursor for, of course, film, television, and radio. In fact, many of the earliest film, television, and radio stars in the U.S. got their start in vaudeville. Names you might recognize like Abbott Costello, the Marx Brothers, Bob Hope, all began in vaudeville. Oh, and two gentlemen that I like to never forget, Ray Bolger and Burt Lahr. Of course, the Lion and the Scarecrow from 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Every medium to large size city had its own vaudeville theater, and of course, Pittsburgh was included in that. Who knows what Pittsburgh's vaudeville theater was? excellent guess. Yes, the Stanley was, of course, a movie theater. But before that, there was actually a theater that was built in 1903. Construction was completed and it opened on Halloween 1904 as the Gaiety Theater downtown. And it still stands today. In the 1930s, it was converted into a movie house and renamed the Fulton. And in the 1990s, of course, the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust purchased it, and it became the Bio Theater, where I'm fortunate to have performed many times in the shadows of greatness. What was so unique about vaudeville was, well, a collection of things. Number one, it was truly a variety style of entertainment. You know, prior to this, you might go to the opera, for example, but you would surely be sitting there all evening listening to opera. But at a vaudeville show, you would have usually 13 acts, a good old-fashioned baker's dozen, and they would range anywhere from magicians to singers to tap dancers to comedians, you name it. In fact, my personal favorite was Lady Godiva, a woman who, true story, used to ride on stage on top of a horse with her hair as long as most of the stage, delicately covering her in the nude, or whatever that version was, and just ride around the stage with her super long hair and be Lady Godiva. That was her act. Yeah, I tried it a couple years ago and it was not successful. Nobody loved me. Weirdest thing. But generally, vaudeville was known as being very family-friendly entertainment. The acts ranged all across the board, but one thing was certain is that there was something for everyone. You know, the rich folks could book the seats in the box, up in the loft, to stay away from the riffraff. And then the riffraff, like you and me, could be down here on the floor in the cheap seats, you see. So there was something for everyone in vaudeville. And it was also highly censored for the day. In fact, two famous producers who went on to become Broadway producers, B.F. Keith and E.F. Albee, were quoted once as saying, "Don't say Holly G or son of a gun on this stage unless you want to be canceled preemptorily." I think it's fair to say we've come a long way as far as what we consider appropriate stage language since the days of vaudeville. But Holly G, on that note, I'd say let's bring out our Abbey Players again to present another tune from 1917 that was later made very famous by Debbie Reynolds, but written in 1917, and embodies the quintessential lightheartedness of vaudeville-style entertainment. actually a vaudeville song from 1917. For the record, the chimpy always comes before the monk. C before M. That's the only way I can remember it. Now, these fun and silly songs of vaudeville were made famous by the biggest stars of the day. We didn't have television yet. We didn't have film stars yet. But what we did have, as we discussed with the Bayeux Theater, were the vaudeville circuits that toured every medium to large size city. So for the first time in America, these entertainers singing the songs that had come out of Tin Pan Alley and the tunes written by Irving Berlin and the like could get their music and themselves to towns all across the United States. Stars like Sophie Tucker, Fanny Brice, as we said, Abbott and Costello and the Marx Brothers, Eddie Cantor, Al Jolson, the list goes on. And of course, let's not forget the many people whose careers were launched by vaudeville, who went on to long careers in film and television and radio. And there was also a one woman named Nora Mays, who was known to be America's sweetheart. In fact, she was such a beloved darling that it was her face that later graced the front of the sheet music for Over There. Nora Mays was unique in that she was not just a singer, not just a pretty face, but she was also known to be quite the hilarious comedian, and she wrote many of her songs with her husband. So this next song was written by Nora Mays and her husband, Jack Norworth. The night was mighty dark, so they could hardly see, but the moon began to shine. Couples sitting underneath the willow tree, for love they pined. A little maid was kind of afraid of darkness, so she said, I think I'll go. Boy began to sigh, looked up to the sky, told the moon his little tale of woe. Oh, shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. I ain't had no lovin' since January, February, June, or July. Snow time ain't no time to stay outside and croon. So shine on, harvest moon, for me and my gal. Let me hear it now. Shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. You ain't had no lovin' since February, terrible. Snow time ain't no time to stay outside and croon. So shine on, harvest moon, for me and my gal. Thank you for being here with us. Now, with the rise of World War I, entertainers like Nora Mays and Irving Berlin would shift from being just entertainers with popular music to a legitimate part of the wartime effort. As the war era progressed, music began to be used as propaganda. So it could be used to unite, to drive forces, as a rallying cry, any number of things. And in 1917, I have a distinct feeling that just about every boy named Johnny thought that this song was for him. Anyone out there named Johnny? I'm coming for you. Oh Johnny, how you can love. Oh Johnny, heaven above. You make my sad heart jump with joy. And when you're near, I just can't sit still a minute. I'm so, oh Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love you so? You're not handsome, it's true, but when I look at you, I just, oh Johnny, oh. Now let me tell you a little story here about Johnny. All the girls Johnny, oh Johnny, heaven above, you make my sad heart jump with joy. And when you're near, I just can't sit still a minute or so. Oh Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love you so? You're not handsome, it's true, but when I look at you, I just, oh Johnny, oh. All right, who's named Johnny? Because this song, I put it in the set just for you. No one? I find that hard to believe that in Western Pennsylvania, not a single person is named John. Did I see a hand? For everyone down there in the gallery, the cheap seats, as we say, everyone up here is pointing at this poor man. That his name is Johnny, and he refuses to admit it. Well, I'll sing to you from over here. Sing along if you know the words. Oh Johnny, how you can love. Oh Johnny, heaven above, you make my sad heart jump with joy. And when you're near, I just can't sit still a minute. I'm so, oh Johnny, please tell me, dear, what makes me love you so? You're not handsome, it's true, but when I look at you, I just, oh Johnny, oh Johnny, oh Johnny. Now, does anyone know who else made that song extremely famous during the Second World War? Just a bit of trivia. Good guess. The Andrews Sisters. So the Andrews Sisters had a fantastic rendition of that song. So you see how many songs that are in the popular American musical vernacular were actually written during the years of World War I. And then when we had radio and film and television was when they could truly explode and become American songs as we now know. Now, later that same year, another important song was released. This is one that would serve as a rallying cry for U.S. patriotism. In fact, to this very day. It was written by the one and only George M. Cohan. Yes, a great American patriot and also a vaudeville performer. He wrote over 150 songs, many of them patriotic, and he was one of the first civilians to ever be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1940 by FDR for his songwriting and his patriotic contributions. You know, some might argue that American songwriters, with their musical propaganda, helped to win the war. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry, don't delay, right away, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such World War I musical propaganda movement. But not everyone was on board, of course. Not everyone wanted to go to war. As the war era had progressed, people realized more and more that, yes, perhaps this was going to indeed become necessary for us to enter this conflict. But there were still many who did not want to. You know, the impact that this war would have was still at the forefront of everyone's mind. You have to remember the Civil War was barely 50 years past. So many songwriters and singers began to try to appeal to women, mothers, daughters, in the hopes that they could thereby appeal to fathers, sons, and the lawmakers who were poised to potentially send our boys into harm's way. The Great War could not have been fought without the contribution of American women. And America knew it. My mother's name was Mary. She was so good and true, because her name was Mary. She called me Mary too. She wasn't gay or airy. She's plain as she could be. I hate to be women served at home in factory jobs abandoned by men, or as nurses overseas. Many found themselves asking how it had come to this, and wondering what home would be left if and when the war was over. Angels, they are weeping o'er the foreign war. Transports are sailing from shore to shore. Brave heroes are falling to arise no more, but still the bugle's calling every man to war. After the war is over and the world's at peace, many a heart will be aching after the war has ceased. Many a home will be vacant, many a child be alone, but I hope they'll all be happy in a place called home, sweet home. But I hope they'll all be happy in a place called home, sweet home. The many questions and prayers asked and prayed during the Great War finally found an answer when on November 11th, 1918, the Western Front quieted for good, as men were called to lay down their arms in the Treaty of Versailles. And perhaps there is no more fitting prayer for the future of America, its men, its women, mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons, than the lyrics of Irving Berlin's 1918 anthem, God Bless America. I'd like to welcome the Abbey Players one more time. As the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair as we raise our
down here, what do you call these, the cheap seats?
The gallery.
The gallery, alrighty. Well, thank you once again. Please join me in one more round of applause for Valerie. It's amazing how music really touches all of us in some way. I know I was choked up on a few of those songs, and happy among others, so it really does bring out the realm of history. We're going to do just a little bit of rearranging right here as we get ready for our speaker of the evening, but I do want to take a moment to introduce once again Reverend Benjamin Wright. He's a board member of the Veterans Breakfast Club, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and Air Force pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Wright was a pilot during the Vietnam War and the Cold War and the Gulf War. He served during 3 remarkable historic eras: airlifting refugees out of Saigon, flying supplies into communist-strangled West Berlin, and coordinating support for the liberation of Kuwait. As Reverend Wright, an ordained Anglican minister, he continues to demonstrate the same work ethic and commitment to work with other people to get things accomplished, as he did in his military position as base commander. Benjamin Wright will return to our library as a panelist for the August 24th program, Experience of War and Why Fight. So I'd like to introduce now Reverend Wright, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Well, good evening. The Veterans Breakfast Club is absolutely delighted to have the privilege of being partners with the Peters Township Library as part of this event. The Veterans Breakfast Club forms communities of listening, both veterans and non-veterans, and people are been inspired by that and educated. And many of the veterans who've never told their stories actually receive healing from sharing their stories. So we host about 65 events a year throughout southwestern Pennsylvania. About a third of those are in the evening and are designed primarily for post 9/11 veterans, and then the morning breakfast events are for more seasoned veterans from early eras. But Michael Neiberg received his doctorate in history from Carnegie Mellon University and is the inaugural chair of the studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I have to add to this, because I'm an Air Force veteran, that he also spent 8 years on faculty at the U.S. Air Force Academy. His published work specializes on the First and Second World Wars, notably the American and French experiences. The Wall Street Journal named his Dance of the Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of World War I, published by Harvard University Press in 2011, one of the 5 best books ever written about the First World War. In October 2012, Basic Books published his The Blood of a Free Man, a history of the liberation of Paris in 1944. In May 2015, Basic published his Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe. In October 2016, Oxford University Press published his Path to War, a history of American response to the Great War, 1914 to 1917. Michael Neiberg is also one of the distinguished collaborators of the annotated narrative collections available as World War I and America, told by the Americans who lived it. Project Reader, edited by Pulitzer Prize winner A. Scott Berg. This important new anthology will encourage exploration and discussion of the war's meanings and resonances long after the centennial is over. So we're delighted to have Dr. Neiberg with us this evening.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Eesh, that's too loud. Okay. Okay, well, while he's getting the projector set up here, There we go. So let me just thank Margaret and Myra again for all their hospitality and everything that they did to get me here. We had a little bit of a hard time getting schedules coordinated, but I'm really glad that this worked out. So can we get this to just single slide? Make it easier for everybody to see it. Okay, the image that this PowerPoint presentation begins with is this great political card, this great postcard from 1915, which shows an American bull terrier in the middle. Yeah, you can do it that way. Can't you just put on regular presentation mode? Can you do that? On the PowerPoint? Maybe I'll just go till you do that. And it says, I'm neutral, but I'm not afraid of any of them. And the dog is surrounded by an English bulldog, a German dachshund, a French bulldog, and a Russian wolfhound. And this is a very typical image from 1915. The United States as neutral, the United States is above and past this war, beyond this war. And as I'm going to show you here in the presentation tonight, what I want to do is take you from 1915 to America's entry into the war in 1917. And as Valerie did so beautifully here, we can do this musically as well. I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier is a 1915 song, and then by the time you get to 1917, you're at a very different kind of musical moment with George M. Cohan's Over There. And I want to thank Val wherever she is. I don't think I've ever heard I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier sung live before, so that was really, really great. So what I want to do is take you from this postcard, 1915, and take you to America's entry into the First World War. All right, so what I want to do is take you on a journey. And the man I'm going to use to describe this journey is the American ambassador to Great Britain, a man by the name of Walter Hines Page, who was a North Carolina newspaperman from Wilmington, North Carolina, and was one of the first newspapermen to back Woodrow Wilson for president in 1912. So when Wilson became president, he rewarded Page by sending him to London as U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. When the First World War broke out in August of 1914, Walter Hines Page wrote a remarkable letter to Woodrow Wilson that ended with the lines I hope you'll see here in just a bit. It ended with the lines, "Now and ever I thank heaven for the Atlantic Ocean, thank God we are out of it." Meaning that this was Europe's war, it wasn't ours to fight, it wasn't anything to do with the United States. And what I want to show you here in just a second as we get these slides eventually moving here, by October of 1915, Walter Hines Page wrote a second letter to Woodrow Wilson, or wrote another letter, I should say. This letter said, if Germany wins, the Monroe Doctrine will, can you advance it one more for me, please? Okay. If Germany wins, the Monroe Doctrine will be shot through. We shall have to have a great army and navy. And I have to tell my military friends that when Walter Hines Page wrote those words in October 1915, he meant it negatively. He meant that national security, something the United States had never had to pay for before, now the United States was going to have to start to pay for. And in another letter to Woodrow Wilson, he said, it'll be a decision of whether we build one university or one battleship a month. And it was clear to Walter Hines Page that he would rather have the universities than the battleship. His letter continued, suppose that England wins. We shall then have merely an academic dispute with her. It is a matter of life or death for English-speaking civilization. So what I want to do here is take you from 1914, August 1914, now and ever I thank heaven for the Atlantic Ocean, thank God we are out of it, to October 1915, which is life or death for English-speaking civilization. Now, Walter Hines Page was a little bit ahead of where most Americans were, but not that far ahead. And in the summer of 1916, Walter Hines Page was so worried that President Wilson wasn't taking this war seriously enough that he came back from London to Washington, and he went to the White House to meet with the president, and Wilson refused to meet with him. So Walter Hines Page went to Wilson's summer home, Shadow Lawn on the coast of New Jersey, near where Seagirt is today, and waited on the president's front porch for the president to show up. That's how seriously Walter Hines Page was taking these issues. So that's what I'd like to do. I want to take you from, it isn't our war, to we have to get involved in this war, and explain how we did that. Now, I'm also going to do this, hopefully we get these slides moving here in a little bit. I also want to do this by focusing on this region and this part of the country as much as I can. Both because Pittsburgh's story is interesting, there are a lot of interesting people that come out of it, and because this is where I'm from too. As you heard, I went to Carnegie Mellon. I also grew up in Squirrel Hill and went to Taylor Alderdice High School. So this is a part of the world that means a lot to me. And one of the things that I want to do is talk to you about the ways in which the United States and Pittsburgh were reacting to the events of the First World War. And there's been a lot of myth, there's been a lot of wrong information that's been out there about how the United States reacted. And sometimes you'll pick up history textbooks and you'll see that the United States was so neutral that Americans weren't paying any attention to the war. And that is an easy myth to dispel. All you have to do is look at newspapers, look at what people were writing, look at their diaries, look at their letters, and you'll see pretty quickly that the American people understood that this was the most important event that was likely to happen in their lifetimes. And while we're waiting for this, I'll tell a quick little story to explain that. When the war broke out, this being a time when the United States had very few banking laws and very few controls over the flow of gold, the European governments that were involved in the war were selling the stocks they had in American companies, converting that money to gold, and then taking the gold back to Europe. And the United States government was so terrified that the United States would run out of gold that the United States government took the incredibly unusual step in late August of 1914 of ordering that the New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago stock markets be shut down. And they stayed shut down until after Thanksgiving. That's a remarkable thing. And Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, who was also his son-in-law, loaded up trucks with gold and had them drive through the streets of American cities to banks to let the American people know it's okay. It's okay, we still have gold. Right? So if you can imagine these events that are going on, the American people are paying intensive attention to what is going on in the war. And one of the people paying closest attention, we'll get to her, I hope, in just a minute, is another native of this part of the world, a mystery writer named Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who was then living in Sewickley, Pennsylvania. Now, after World War I, she'll be called the American Agatha Christie for her mystery novels. Now, I've read her mystery novels. Frankly, they're not that good. She was also writing, however, for the Saturday Evening Post, and writing wonderful explorations of the American West, of industrial America, of the way that life was here in the United States. Now, she was in New York City at a dinner hosted by the Saturday Evening Post. Can you go 2 forward, please? Maybe 1 more, please. Perfect. There's Mary Roberts Reinhardt right there. She's at a dinner in New York City, hosted by the Saturday Evening Post, when the editor-in-chief of the Saturday Evening Post made her a remarkable offer. He said that he had arranged for her to go to Europe to meet with the King and Queen of England, the Kaiser and his wife in Germany, the President of France and his wife, and he had also arranged for Mary Roberts Reinhardt to be the first woman to be allowed to go into the trenches of the Western Front, on both sides of the Western Front. And he would pay her $1,000 a column to do it, which was an enormous amount of money, probably the most that any American journalist had ever been offered in their life. So the story goes that she's at this dinner, and Mary Roberts Reinhardt's husband stands up and says, "My wife isn't going, I forbid it." Whereupon Mary Roberts Reinhardt stood up and said, "I do not intend for the greatest event of my life to happen, and I not be a part of it." So Mary Roberts Reinhardt's husband turned to the editor of the Saturday Evening Post and said, "If you take out a $10,000 life insurance policy on her, you can have her for 6 weeks." True story. So she went. She went for 8 weeks. So she went. And there's a lot of interesting things about Mary Roberts Reinhardt's journey from Sewickley, Pennsylvania, through New York City to the Western Front and the royal capitals, the capitals of the European belligerents. What's interesting to me is that her journey was like that of most other American journalists. Can you go back 1 slide for me, please? If you can. If not, don't worry about it. Can you reverse 1 slide? Don't worry about it. Her journey, no, back the other way. Yeah, your other way, right? Nope, still back the other way. You're ruining the surprise. All right, anyway, trust me, Mary Roberts Reinhardt was like most other American journalists. She said, "I'm going to Europe as a neutral, my country is neutral, I'm going to expose the insanity of all of the great powers." And what's interesting to me is that Mary Roberts Reinhardt, I'm just going to take this over just a second. Is that working? They don't work. Wow, okay, don't worry about it. Mary Roberts Reinhardt, Richard Harding Davis, all of these famous American journalists went to Europe believing the same thing, that all of the European parties must somehow be equally guilty. And they all go to Europe, and they all end up turning their opinions. In fact, a couple of American journalists become so pro-Allied that they volunteer or try to volunteer for the Allied armies. Chicago's most famous newspaperman actually tried to volunteer for the French army until his boss talked him out of it. If you do it, you don't have a job when you come back, kind of thing. Now, Mary Roberts Reinhardt and these other journalists, there are 4 things that are in common in their writings in late 1914 that to me are very interesting. 1, they all said that the United States has a clear interest in Britain and France winning this war. That Germany is clearly the aggressor, and that a German-dominated Europe is not in America's best interest. That what Germany wants to do is to destroy the democratic governments of Britain and France. Second, she said, it is, however, not our war. That is, we should stand on the sidelines and help the British and French as much as we can, but it's not our war. Remember, this is late 1914. Third, she told her readers, as did Richard Harding Davis, as did all of these reporters, the British are trying to trick you. They are sending you propaganda that's not true. Don't believe it. Believe instead what we Americans have seen with our own eyes, because it's bad enough. So when we think about propaganda in the First World War, yes, the British were sending propaganda. Yes, the British controlled the transatlantic cables. But American journalists were saying, don't believe any of it. Don't believe any of it. Richard Harding Davis was in the Belgian city of Leuven, which the Germans burned to the ground, and witnessed the whole thing. He wrote back dispatches saying, I can report on what the Germans actually did. And it's bad enough. It's bad enough. We have to stop it. We as Americans have a responsibility to stop it. And fourth, although Mary Roberts Reinhardt and the other reporters said this isn't our fight, they clearly understood that it wouldn't take very much for it to become our fight. Therefore, it was up to the United States to start thinking about what the United States might do if it did become our fight. Remember, we don't have that great Army and Navy, as Walter Hines Page mentioned. Now, Mary Roberts Reinhardt came back to the United States just a couple of weeks before a German submarine sank the Lusitania. Now, I do this all the time. I had to do it with my daughter in her 10th grade history textbook. She brought home a worksheet that said which of the following events led the United States to enter World War I. And she brought it to me like a proud daughter and said, Dad, look, we're studying World War I. Did I get the right answer? And I said to her, honey, none of these is right, but circle C because that's what your teacher wants. Okay? C was the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, if I tell you that the sinking of the Lusitania occurred in May of 1915, and the United States didn't enter World War I until April of 1917, that ought to be good enough, right? But the Lusitania is important, and here's why. It finally forced Americans to answer the questions that Mary Roberts Reinhardt and Walter Hines Page and others had been posing. What do you now want to do about this war? Now it is coming closer to us. What do you want to do about it? You could, as Theodore Roosevelt, the former president, wanted to do, start to build that great Army and Navy that Walter Hines Page talked about. You could start to introduce something that Americans had never had before called an income tax to pay for the Army and the Navy. That's an option. You could, as the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, argued, just ban all Americans from traveling overseas. You could do that as well. That's what Bryan wanted to do. Or you could try some middle course, which is what the president decided to do. The president decided to go to the Germans and say, you can't sink ships that have Americans on them. We won't put up with it. William Jennings Bryan resigned as Secretary of State over this issue. And most of the Republican Party, which is the party that was not in the White House, Wilson was a Democrat, most of the senior Republicans in the country broke with Woodrow Wilson over how he handled the Lusitania. Wilson gave a very famous speech in which he said this country is too proud to fight, which drove the Republican Party leadership insane with anger. Theodore Roosevelt later said in 1917, if Wilson doesn't go to war now, I will go to the White House and I will, and here's a direct quote, I will skin him alive. I think about this period whenever people say we're in a brand new hyper-partisan era in American politics. You should read what Theodore Roosevelt started to say about Woodrow Wilson after the Lusitania. And you should read what Theodore Roosevelt's daughter said about Woodrow Wilson. She was married to the Speaker of the House. A very interesting moment. Now, as 1915 became 1916, American anger towards the Germans just grew and grew and grew. This cartoon shows the Kaiser with a dripping scimitar, that is blood dripping above him there, wearing an Ottoman fez, and the caption reads, "A la Mittuns." This is a takeoff on the German belt buckles, which said, "Gott Mittuns," God is with us. What this cartoon is saying is that it is the Germans who are responsible for the massacre of the Armenians in 1915. The Armenians being a Christian population living inside the Muslim Ottoman Empire. And the cause of the Armenians drew tremendous sympathy from the United States. Philadelphia held an Armenia Day to raise about $2 million. for Armenian relief in one day, which is a lot of money in 1916. There were also a number of spy and sabotage scandals. Some of you may know if you're from New Jersey or have been there. What is today the beautiful Liberty State Park in New Jersey, where you can see a beautiful image of the Statue of Liberty. If you're looking at the Statue of Liberty, and you kind of turn around and go back, you'll see a series of piers that were back there. In July of 1916, a German spy team blew them up. The biggest, deadliest act of terrorism in United States history up to that point. The right arm of the Statue of Liberty was closed from 1916 until just a couple of years ago because of damage that it took in that incident. Now, it took until 1953 for the United States to definitively prove that the Germans had been behind it, but in 1916, almost everybody knew exactly who had been responsible. The United States set up a special task force. The New York City Police Department set up a beautifully named Neutrality and Bomb Squad, led by the brother of the boxer Gene Tunney, who arranged for the very first telephone tap in New York City history, in United States history, to listen in on the conversations going between the German consulate and the German embassy in Washington, to uncover all kinds of sabotage incidents, directed and led by the Germans. Now, again, this led to the question, what do you want to do about it? Do you want to reshape the way you think about your military? Do you want to build a bigger army? Do you want to build a bigger navy? What do you actually want to do about this? It's going to be expensive to build those things. Do you really want to do this? And for reasons that I can talk about in the question and answer if anybody's interested, the US government did almost nothing. There was a proposal called the Continental Army Plan to reform the way the United States thought about its military. Wilson refused to support it. It died. And the Secretary of War, William Lindley Garrison, resigned in protest in the middle of an election year. That's two cabinet members now, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War that resigned. Right? Don't tell me this isn't an interesting period to study. Go to the next slide, please. So, this movement that became known as preparedness became run by private individuals. If the government won't do it, we'll do it. And this is my favorite example of that. This is an image from the fall of 1915. This is an AT&T ad. This is an ad for AT&T. Your cell phone provider today, for those of you who are too young to remember what those phones look like. Here is an Army staff officer, right there. In this circle is Paul Revere. It says 1775 underneath it. And the text reads in part, in its wonderful preparedness to inform its citizens of a national need, the United States stands alone and unequaled. It can command the entire Bell telephone system, which completely covers our country with its network of wires. In other words, we, AT&T, are the new Paul Revere. Theodore Roosevelt and the retired head of the US Army, General Leonard Wood, started a program for young men in between their college summers, to go up to a place called Plattsburgh, New York, a mosquito-infested army camp, and volunteer to be run through the paces of military training so that in case there was a war, there would be at least some Americans that knew how to read a map, knew how to fire a gun, and knew the rudiments of what the Army did. A guy by the name of Thomas Edison created a Committee for American Scientific Preparedness with chapters in 47 of the 48 states to get the American scientific community ready. Charles Mayo of the Mayo Clinic worked with 2 Pittsburgh doctors to create a Committee of Medical Preparedness. And my single favorite example of all, the History Department at Columbia University started doing calisthenics on the quad at Columbia University to encourage young men that were students there to get into better physical shape. Columbia's president, who was a pacifist, sent a letter to the entire faculty of Columbia University in the early 1916, and he said, the US Army is organized into a G structure. G1 is personnel, G2 is intelligence, G3 is operations, etc., etc. Put your name on this sheet where your talents best apply in case your country needs you. And every single member of the Columbia faculty did it. And their president was a pacifist. Preparedness. What are we prepared to do as Americans? That Plattsburgh movement that I mentioned, Theodore Roosevelt didn't really think that would produce officers. What he thought it would do is shame Woodrow Wilson into doing something from Washington. And as a result, we have this strange privatization of the way that America is thinking about its military. Now, we can think about this because we are making an unbelievable, next slide please, an unbelievable amount of money off of this war. A tremendous amount of money off of this war. This is John T. McCutcheon, who won one of the first Pulitzer Prizes for editorial cartooning. This is April 1915. This is before the Lusitania. Look at the docks of New York City. They are literally magnets. Uncle Sam's got his arms open as the money, marks, pounds, francs, and rubles come from Europe and work their way across the Atlantic Ocean with a fat and happy Uncle Sam, or New York banker, I guess that is, gleeful at all the money that the United States is going to make. As soon as that stock market crisis ended, American industrialists started talking about World War I as the chance to reorient the entire world financial system from London and Paris to New York and Washington. If we play our cards right, we can shift the entire global financial system. And my wife and daughters are sick of me doing this, but when you go to those beautiful New York City skyscrapers, the DuPont gardens, all of these beautiful things in eastern Pennsylvania, almost all of them are built in the early 1920s. Where do you think the money came from? Where do you think the money came from? The Frick Museum in Manhattan. Same thing, built in 1919, I think. The DuPont Gardens in I can't remember, just in Delaware, built in 1920. That's where the money's coming from. Next slide, please. And this will show you what I mean. August of 1914, when World War I breaks out, the US has a trade deficit with Europe. Look how fast that changes. Look how fast that changes. And the overwhelming majority of that money, that trade, is being done with Britain and France. Both because that's where American sympathies are, and because that's the only way you can get stuff to Europe before the Second World War. 90% of American trade is either financed by a British bank, insured by a British insurance company, or travels on a British boat. 90%. And as some of you already know, the only way the Germans can stop this shipping is with the submarine. The British have a much more elegant way of doing it. They can sail a battleship or a cruiser up to a ship. They can let everybody stay in place without shooting them. They can inspect the cargo. If they see something that's headed to Germany or one of Germany's border countries, they can take it off, and they can give the company a chip that they can then get money from the British government for those goods. That's better than torpedoing it. Right? And for this reason, almost all American trade is going to Britain and France. Almost all of it. And as you can see, we're making a lot of money. Which raises a very important question for Mary Roberts Reinhardt. She's not the only one asking it. I found, when I was in Tennessee doing research on this in Nashville, I found at least 7 Sunday sermons about this from 1960. What does it mean about us as a country? If there's a war going on the other side of the Atlantic, and we believe Britain and France should win it, but our role in this war is to make money, what kind of people are we? And Mary Roberts Reinhardt, again, with the perfect way, the perfect use of words. What does it mean if Pittsburgh is fattening on catastrophe? Do we have a right to make money? Could I have the next slide, please? So, what do you do with that money? I told you I'd have some Pittsburgh stuff for you. Canadians have a rule called CanCon. A certain percentage of all Canadian TV and radio has to be Canadian content. This is YinzerCon. So this is Kennywood Park. This is Kennywood Park. August 2nd, 1917. So almost exactly 100 years ago, 100 years ago yesterday, saying that it's Serbia Day. All revenue from Kennywood Park will go to the relief of Serbia, fighting on the Allied side. That is the British and French side. There was a proposal that college football would donate all the proceeds of the 1916 football season to relief in France. You can guess, this is even 100 years ago, guess what the college president said? No, that's our money. But they did agree to pass buckets around for the relief of Britain and France. John Wanamaker in Philadelphia raised millions of dollars. Cities raised entire ambulance corps for the British and French. Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I went to college, created 2 entire field ambulances for France. There were nurses from 47 of the 48 states operating in France. 47 of the 48 states had nurses operating in France on behalf of the French. Remarkable. Remarkable. Near as I can figure, it's hard to calculate, but about 90% of American charitable giving went to 3 countries. It went to France, it went to Serbia, and it went to the relief of Polish Jews, who were kind of stuck in the middle on the Eastern Front. Can I have the next slide, please? Some people gave more than their money. This is a remarkable group of people called the Lafayette Escadrille. These are, for the most part, incredibly wealthy men, many of whom owned their own airplanes, who when the war began, they're Americans, who when the war began volunteered to fight in the French Foreign Legion. And then the guy that's behind the lion cub here, you can't really see him, he's right there, Billy Thaw, born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, buried in Allegheny Cemetery. Not really all that far from here. Billy Thaw got the idea. We should form a volunteer air squadron for the French. In 1915, he got this idea. Billy Thaw had the first private pilot license in New York City, New York State. Flew an airplane underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. I wouldn't do it, he did it. You can imagine the popularity of these guys. Americans willing to risk their lives, and several of them do get killed during war, for France. Theodore Roosevelt loved them. Cornelius Vanderbilt said, you give me your bills, I'll pay them. That's why they have this crazy, they have 2 lion cubs as mascots. That's whiskey right there, and the other one is soda. There's soda right there. How they kept the lion cubs away from the puppy, I have no idea. And I can't prove it, but for our wonderful veteran here from the U.S. Air Force, I think this is the beginning of fighter pilot culture. They knew they were rich, they knew they had money coming in, and they knew that the French wouldn't touch them as long as they continued to be this great PR stunt, and as long as they continued to have this great combat record. So they flew in their bathrobes when they wanted to. When they weren't flying, they went to Paris and held legendary parties. Billy Thaw was reported killed in combat. He showed up at a dinner party in New York City to prove that it wasn't true. They did whatever they wanted. They did whatever they wanted. And my favorite quote of this, since I work for the U.S. Army and I know how crazy they can be, after the war, all of these guys applied to be members of the new U.S. Air Corps, U.S. Air Service, and the Air Force turned almost all of them down. Right? They didn't meet the standards. Right? Most of these guys had shut down enough, they were aces on their own. Okay. My in-laws live in Pinehurst, North Carolina. There's a little airfield out there in Carthage, North Carolina, named after this guy, Kevin Rockwell. So it's kind of cool. You can go out there and you can actually see this monument to him. It's really kind of interesting. Can I have the next forward point? This is what the French built in honor of the Lafayette Escadrille. This is the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial in Western Paris, in a place called the Parc de Garges. We know that a lot of very important Americans volunteered for the Allies. Ernest Hemingway was an ambulance driver in Italy. Delwyn Starr, who was probably the biggest, most famous football star for Harvard in 1915, volunteered and was killed on the Somme in 1916. We know a lot of guys did. My colleague Jonathan Vance in Canada estimates that 80,000, that's 80,000 Americans went to Canada and volunteered in the British Army through Canada. Remember, Canada was part of the British Empire then. So they went up to Toronto or Montreal or wherever and joined the British Army there. 80,000 Americans. About 15,000 Americans went to the French consulate in New Orleans and did the same thing. Joyce Kilmer, another famous American killed on the Western Front. Still, Wilson didn't want to do anything. Now, I think to this point of what I've had to tell you, I've told you why American sympathies were pro-Allied. I haven't told you why the United States gets involved in World War I. So let me do that and then wrap up and take any questions that I can. I'm going to show you an image here in just a second that I want you to just take a second to look at and let it sink in, and then I'll explain it to you. And I'm going to tell you right now that I used this image twice recently in Canada. Could I have it, please? This is the cover of Life magazine on February 10th, 1916, and I would like you to please note the date. February 10th, 1916. This is more than a year before U.S. entry into the First World War. I just want to take just a second to look at it while I grab a sip of water here. I love this image. I absolutely love it. I wanted to use it as the cover image for my book, and the publisher said it's too busy, you can't do it. Take a look at this. Most of the United States is labeled as New Prussia. Pittsburgh is called Heidelbergopolis. DC is New Berlin. I don't know what city that is. Maybe Buffalo is Kreuzberg. Florida is Turconia. That's a reference to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. It's a close ally of Germany. The Baja Peninsula is Austriana, after Austria, another close British ally. And this little thing right here, with capital of Goosestep, is the American Reservation. I love it. I love this image. The Gulf of Haight, the Von Tirpitz Ocean. And I want you to notice three more things before I explain what's going on here. One is that Mexico is labeled as the province of Mexico, with Wilhelmsburg as the capital. Now remember all those German sabotage spy things I told you about. In almost every case, after they were exposed, those spies and agents went to Mexico. And remember, there is a Mexican Civil War going on at this time. And the United States is having a heck of a time figuring out what it wants to do about it. I'll get to that one in just a second. The West Coast. is labeled Japonica. And then my favorite part of the map, Canada is labeled Barbarians. Now, I want to make it clear, as I had to do in Canada, I don't think this is a reference to the Canadians themselves. They're not insulting Sidney Crosby. Here's what's going on. Remember, this is February 1960. Here's the fear in the United States, and it's common. A lot of people are talking about this. What happens if Germany defeats the British and French on the Western Front? Or Germany is doing well enough to bring Britain and France to the negotiating table? We live in Pittsburgh, right? It was French once. How did it become British? It became British because the French lost a war in Europe. Here's the fear. What happens if Germany puts enough pressure on Britain and France that they come to the negotiating table, and in order to minimize their losses in Europe, they give up what they have in North America? What happens if the British give to the Germans all of Canada? What happens if the French give up Martinique and Guadeloupe, which are right here? Remember, the US opened the Panama Canal in 1914. In 1916, the US took the preemptive step of buying the Danish Virgin Islands from Denmark because they were afraid that Germany would blackmail the Danes by threatening to invade them and then take the islands and build a naval base in the Danish Virgin Islands. 1914 is the first time, 1915 is the first time the United States seriously considers how to defend Puerto Rico. That's not an accident. The fear is that if we do nothing, we Americans do nothing, don't build an army, don't build a navy, and don't do something, we can end up with a future looking something like this. And we didn't do anything to cause it. The fear, and a lot of Americans are talking about it, is that we'll end up like China. What they mean is a rich, powerful country with no way to defend itself that the Europeans pick apart. That's the fear. And if America looks weak, maybe what the Germans would do is form an alliance with the Japanese and the Mexicans to carve apart the United States. And this fear is here in February of 1916. If we do nothing, this is the future that we might face. Now, a lot of people in 1916 are saying, that's crazy. That's nuts. To believe in anything like this, you gotta be out of your mind. No one would do a thing like that. Can we go backwards yet, or are we still forward? It's okay if we only forward. Okay, can you go forward for me, please? So remember, this isn't just a fear. This isn't just something that people are making up to put on the cover of Life magazine. 1916, Pancho Villa raids the United States, raids New Mexico, causing the United States to send an invasion force with men like Dwight Eisenhower, George Marshall, George Patton, John Pershing in it, into Mexico to try to find him. And by the way, they don't. Pancho Villa took with him an American woman named Maud Adams, who he had kidnapped, brought her to New Mexico and let her go. Maud Adams told American reporters Pancho Villa had bragged that it was Germany and Japan that was paying his bills. The American ambassador to Germany, James Gerard, wrote a letter to Wilson. Said every night, 30 million Germans go to bed sad because the US is not at war with Mexico. This is a real threat. This is a genuine threat. Now, as I said, a lot of people think that this is just crazy talk, right? Next slide, please. March 1917. This thing hits the American newspapers. This is a telegram. I'll read it in just a sec here. From the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, using American telegraph lines, because the US is still neutral, to Washington, D.C., and then from Washington, D.C., using American telegraph lines to Mexico City, the German legation in Mexico City. Okay? The context of this is that the Germans are getting ready to start submarine warfare again. They're not winning the war on land, so the Navy says, let us unleash the submarines. We have these beautiful submarines and you're not letting us use them. It's time to use them. And the German government in late 1916 says, okay, go ahead and do it. They expect that when that happens, the United States will declare war on Germany. So, here's the message. We intend to begin on the 1st of February 1917 unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. Make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Remember, they had been Mexican before 1848. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the President of Mexico of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States is certain, and the suggestion that the President of Mexico should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and Germany. The British intercept this, top secret. They show it to the Americans, and they say, we have this document, but we have a problem. We can't let the Germans know that we're reading their mail. So you need to know this is what the Germans are going to do, but you can't tell anybody. President Wilson says, I can't act on that. So the British come up with something, I just want to mention it because I think it's so brilliant. There are two versions of this telegram. One went from Berlin to Washington, as I said. The second one went from Washington to Mexico City. In encoding them and translating them and coding them and retranslating them, they're a little bit different, just a little bit. So the British said, release the second one. Then the Germans will think that the slip-up happened on the Mexican end. The Germans will think that the codes were broken on the Mexican end. They'll blame Mexico. And we'll be okay. So that's what the Americans do. Wilson has it. He releases it to his friends in the media. He doesn't release it himself because he's concerned about what that'll look like. And the Americans go nuts, as you might guess. Some of Wilson's critics say this is fake. The British are trying to trick us. Arthur Zimmerman, the man who wrote it, is at a press conference in Berlin. Somebody says, hey, what about this telegram the Americans have? Zimmerman says, yeah, I wrote it. They got me. There's no sense covering it up. Now I can negotiate with Mexico and Japan openly. They got me. And he admits that he wrote it. What do you think the response is in this country? Okay. If you live out west, in Texas or Arizona, what's this war about now? If you live in Pittsburgh, what's this war about now? It's now about the future of your country. Right? I was just in New Zealand at a World War I conference, and there's a really interesting problem that historians are trying to solve. New Zealand has the highest percentage of young men who volunteered for World War I with no threat of conscription over their head. And the question is why? No place on earth is further from the Western Front than New Zealand. And the answer, we think, is that those men in New Zealand knew that if Britain lost the war and Germany took New Zealand, that's it for their homes. That's it for their farms. They'll become German. Right? Now what's this war about for the United States? It's about survival now. It's about self-defense. And I can come back to that if you want a little bit too. This is why the American people are going to war. Not Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, not remaking the world, not making the world safe for democracy. We're trying to make this go away. Now, I want to tell you too, when this happens, the American people figure this is the equivalent of a declaration of war. New York City went on a war footing. Massachusetts called out its National Guard. Philadelphia set up a militia to guard the harbors. Wilson's cabinet told him, Mr. President, if you don't declare war now, the Senate may declare it without you. And two members of his cabinet said, Mr. President, if you don't declare war, if you don't ask for a declaration of war, we are resigning. And one of those two was his son-in-law, William Gibbs Mackie. Wilson has a cabinet meeting. He says to his cabinet, thank you, gentlemen, I've heard what you have to say, and walks out of the room. This is when Theodore Roosevelt wrote that line, right? If he doesn't declare war now, I will skin him alive. Can I have the next slide, please? These are some of the political cartoons that you see. This is the Kaiser's hand carving up. America reads for myself. This reads for Mexico. And remember that Life magazine image I showed you, right? Japan, right here, right? The Zimmerman telegram said Texas, New Mexico, Arizona goes to Germany. It didn't say anything about California. Now we know why. Right? That's going to be the lure to get the Japanese in. That's how they're going to pull the Japanese in. And you can see this image right here. The Kaiser depicted as Satan, handing a bag of gold to a Mexican that's supposed to look like Pancho Villa, I suppose, pointing to Arizona, Mexico, and Texas. As far as Americans are concerned, we're already at war. We're just waiting for the president to do something about it. This is why, I think, we commemorate World War I, or we used to, on November 11th. That's the day the Germans agreed to an armistice and put their weapons down. Once they've done that, America's safe. And on November 12th, people from Peters Township to Texas to Michigan, all over the country, start saying, all right, bring my son home. Bring my husband home, bring my brother home, we're done. We're done. Wilson instead comes out with the 14 points and remaking the world, which some Americans believed in and some didn't. All right, I'm going to finish up here with a little more Yinzer Khan. We're going to come back to Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Can I have the next slide, please? She wrote this shortly after she heard about the Zimmerman telegram. She wrote this in late February. It's published in March, but she wrote it in late February. Wilson didn't go to the Congress until early April. She wrote that this war, even though she had 2 sons who were old enough now to be drafted, she said, we can't do what we did in the American Civil War, which is allow rich people to buy their way out. If this is a war for the survival of the nation, everybody's got to serve. And that means putting my 2 sons at risk. And then she writes and says, if we had been preparing for this war since the sinking of the Lusitania, we wouldn't be in this position. If we'd had an army and a navy, Germany never would have dared to do something this audacious. Instead, we lost that time. So she says, if in this war we allow the few to fight for us, then as a nation we have died and our ideals have died with us. Though we win, if we have not borne this burden of life, then do we all lose. And this line to me is really interesting. We are virtually at war. By the time this is published, perhaps the declaration will have been made. Late February. In other words, it's time to get off your butt, Mr. President. It's time to do something. Instead, Wilson reacted with what's called the overt act speech, in which he said, I know the Germans have said they're going to do this, but I don't believe they're actually going to do it. So until they commit an overt act, I won't declare war. Then the Germans torpedo a ship called the USS Laconia. There is a very famous American reporter on that ship named Floyd Gibbons. Gibbons is in a lifeboat in the middle of the North Atlantic with a British reporter who looks at Gibbons and says, is this your bloody overt act or what? And Gibbons turns to him and says, I don't know. I don't know. This is what Mary Roberts Reinhardt wrote. She wrote, America is the last stand of the humanities on earth, the realization of a dream and the fulfillment of an idea. Britain and France had shared part of that idea and have had a founding role in creating it. Since 1914, they have been fighting for the ideal on which my country was founded. Under the domination of the Prussians, Imperial Germany now threatens those values, not only in Europe, but in America itself. And here's the last line of this powerful article. For Germany had, quote, broken loose something terrible, something that must be killed, or the world dies. Now, Americans may not have known what they wanted to get out of this war, they may not have known what they wanted the peace to be, but they now knew they had no choice but to give up neutrality and enter into this war. And the United States and the world would never be quite the same. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you got, and if anybody's got a pirate score, I'd be happy for that too. Thank you. Valerie, this slide's for you. This is Nora Mays right here.
Yes, it is.
And her husband, you may know, is the guy that wrote Take Me Out to the Ball.
2-0.
4-0 Pittsburgh. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any questions I can answer? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to know, you made a couple comments about 47 out of 48 states send nurses and they did other things. Who was the holdout?
I don't know. Let's see. In the case of the nurses, I think it was Arizona. I think it was Arizona. And I should note that the president of, the guy that was in charge of the historically black colleges and universities took great pride that every historically black college and university in America sent nurses as well. So there's a very interesting African-American angle to this story as well. But I think it was Arizona. Which is sort of very far away from all of this and very sparsely populated in that time period. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't there a cavalry regiment go into Mexico to help them, help part of that Civil War at one time during First World War?
Yeah, there is a revolution in Mexico in 1911, and then it breaks quickly down into civil war. And Wilson struggled to figure out which side he wanted to back. So the reason Pancho Villa invaded the United States is that the U.S. had promised to back him, and then changed their minds and picked somebody else to back. So we're involved, we're sending troops, we're going to Veracruz, we're going to northern Mexico, we're doing all kinds of stuff. So yeah, there are American forces in Mexico. And famously, they're trying to find Pancho Villa, and they can't. Which is part of the reason Germany figured we can push these guys. If they can't find Pancho Villa, they're not coming over to Europe. They were wrong about that. Happy to say. German one? Okay, so the German-American population is really a complicated story. There is a pro-German voice in the United States that goes virtually silent after the Lusitania. So the guy that is the center of this is a Harvard professor named Ugo Munsterberg. He's actually very instrumental in the creation of Wonder Woman, believe it or not. He's a really interesting guy, and he's the main pro-German voice in the United States. He's teaching at Harvard. It's a really complicated thing, but what Munsterberg observes and what I think I can corroborate pretty well is that it really matters whether you're Prussian or non-Prussian, and Mary Roberts Reinhardt's comment there, under Prussia's domination, right? It matters whether you're Catholic or Protestant, and it really matters whether you were born in Germany or born in the United States. So Munsterberg, who was born in Danzig, writes these things about he can't understand German Americans. They don't understand Germany anymore, they only understand America. And here, of course, I'm talking about men like Eddie Rickenbacker, Dwight Eisenhower, John Pershing, who are all German Americans. So there is a pro-German kind of argument until the Lusitania, and then it drops off. And then by late 1916, there are German-American journalists like Oswald Villard, some of these very famous guys, Edward Brumley, who are saying, look, we don't want Germany and the United States to go to war, but if they do, and they take out the Kaiser and bring democracy to Germany, then it'll be worth it. So it's a really complicated picture. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, the Lusitania. Now they ascertained that the Lusitania was indeed carrying contraband.
Yeah.
Did the Germans know that and sink the Lusitania, or did they just get plain lucky and hitting the Lusitania? You know, in other words, they have intelligence.
Yeah.
The Lusitania was actually carrying contraband cargo.
This is a wonderful history too. Yes, the Germans knew the Lusitania was probably carrying contraband cargo. Yes, they targeted the Lusitania. You can't miss it. It's the only four-funneled steamer on the Atlantic Ocean. Everybody who knew anything about anything knew which one was the Lusitania. What's interesting to me is that argument that the Lusitania was carrying armaments, therefore the Germans had a right to sink it, doesn't really come up in the US until the 1930s. In 1915, what Americans say is, well, it might have been carrying armaments. That doesn't excuse killing 128 Americans. And the analogy that I would draw would be if an airliner were flying near Iran or North Korea, and the North Koreans or Iranians shot it down. The question in tomorrow's news would not be what was in the cargo hold. The question would be, Americans are dead, what do we do with it? And it's the same thing in 1950. Yes, ma'am.
President Wilson had a number of strokes during his presidency and even before he became president. Do you think there was other influences that, with having a stroke and trying to keep that secret impacted some of his decision making?
So I don't. The two big strokes happened during the peace conference, after the Paris Peace Conference and just before the vote in the Senate. I have to be perfectly honest. The more I study the First World War, the less I like Woodrow Wilson. The less impressed I am by Woodrow Wilson. He's a politician trying desperately to hang on to a middle that is fading away from him. So I don't think the strokes impact that. They absolutely impact the debates over the Treaty of Versailles. They absolutely impact that. But they don't impact the decision to go to war. First, some hands up top. I don't want to forget the folks up top. Upper St. Clair, how are you? How did the home front effort in World War I compare to World War II? They're very, very similar. So another thing that we do as a country is we make World War II the good one, and then we make World War I the kind of, well, it's over here somewhere. And you can see that beautifully if you go to Washington, D.C., where we built that, in my view, monstrosity of the Second World War monument. And there's nothing to the First World War except the Washington, D.C. memorial, which is kind of hidden over by the MLK. They're going to build something. They're now talking about building something. But the effort is really, really similar. That is, the American people are doing everything. And they're doing this before U.S. entry. There was a wonderful exhibit. I was in Belgium. There's a wonderful exhibit. The United States sent sacks of wheat over to Belgium. And then the Belgian women would sew and embroider the sacks and send them back. And they're works of art. They're beautiful. And so the United States is involved in this effort even before we got to war. But the home front effort is really similar. Sewing clubs, money being raised, anything you can imagine is being done on the home front in the First World War as well as the Second. Yes, ma'am.
In the scary map you showed before, what was Florida?
Florida was Turconia. In other words, after the Turks, the Ottomans. And I don't think anybody in the United States was seriously worried about Turkey invading Florida, but there is a series of books. In fact, One of them takes place in Pittsburgh. I went online and bought a first edition of it just because I had to. There is this kind of invasion scare literature that in 1914, early 1915, that is pre-Lusitania, the enemy is sort of unidentified. It's some enemy European that's coming after America. After 1915, it's the Germans. So there's a series of 3 books in defense of New York, in defense of Washington. In other words, the Germans get New York, they get Washington, and the final battle is here in Pittsburgh. And the end of the book, one of the kids says to the other, it's a kind of Red Dawn story, right? The army's beaten, so it's the kids that defend Pittsburgh. And they say, hey, we beat the Germans, isn't that great? And another one of the kids says, well, we never would have had to do it if we'd had an army. If we built an army and a navy, we never would have needed to do this. All right, so there's a clear political message, but it's great. The book's called In Defense of Pittsburgh. I had no choice but to find a first edition. It's not really all that good, except as an historical artifact. Anybody else in the upper deck? Yes, sir?
What reparations were made to German-American companies after the war?
None. What reparations were made to German-American companies after the war? Almost none. So what actually happens, it's actually kind of quite clever. The United States government intentionally goes to German-American owned companies and says, this is a patriotic effort. If you're going to be patriotic and you're going to help us, you have access to these contracts. So I actually found when I was at Florida State doing a seminar, so I went to their library and I found this remarkable consortium that gets built to build lumber, to take Florida lumber and sell it to the US government to do whatever it is you do with lumber, to build tents, I guess. And it talks specifically about going for German-American companies to make sure that they're involved. So as long as they're loyal, as long as they're doing what they need to do, there's no need to worry about it. Yes, ma'am.
On that cartoon, it was 1914, 50, hollow mix. There was an emblem or a symbol that almost looked like a swastika.
Yeah. The question is, what is the symbol on the belt buckle of the Germans? It's not a swastika. It's an iron cross, which is a symbol of the German army. It's not a swastika. Yes, sir.
How effective was the intention for the? How effective was the attempt on both sides to starve out the other?
How effective was the attempt to starve out each other? It's incredibly effective on the Allied side. In fact, it's a major contribution to Allied victory. So the winter of 16-17 in Germany is known as the turnip winter because it's the only crop that they've got. What's significant about that, I'm talking like a history professor here, ask an historian what time it is and he'll tell you how to build a watch. Because Germany can't get food from overseas, it has to keep invading east. It has to go into Ukraine and Russia to steal their food. So the food blockades are really, really important. And historians of the British war effort argue about how close to starvation Britain really was. I think that the standard tack now is they weren't really all that close because they could rely on food from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South America, the United States, all of these places. But Germany really was close to starvation, and it forced the German army to go east. Oh, I saw another hand upstairs. Yes, sir.
You said that Britain exaggerated the situation in their reporting for the U.S.
Sure. The question is about British propaganda in World War I. So there were a limited number of transatlantic cables that went from Europe to the United States. When the First World War broke out, the Royal Navy was already in the North Sea on a pre-planned exercise. And the First Lord of the Admiralty, a young man by the name of Winston Churchill, told the Navy, we know where those transatlantic lines are, rip them up. Don't let Germany be able to communicate directly with the United States. So that's what they did. So that meant that all the news that the United States was getting in the early weeks came from the British. And when the Germans moved through Belgium, British propaganda told all kinds of crazy stories, that the Germans were crucifying nuns, that they were lopping the hands and heads off of Belgian children. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And again, it's Mary Roberts Rinehart and these other Americans who go to Europe and say, we can't find any evidence that that's happening. We can, however, find evidence that the Germans are taking town notables, chaplains, mayors, school teachers, and lining them up and shooting them. We can prove that they're taking critical buildings in these cities, libraries are a major target, and burning them. We can prove that they're taking Belgians and forcibly making them work for the Germans. We can prove all of that, and that's bad enough, right? We know that they're targeting churches. We know that they're targeting entire communities, and that's bad enough. But nailing nuns to the wall? No, they're not doing that. Bayoneting babies? No, they're not doing that. And right around the time that the Lusitania comes out, there's a report called the Bryce Report that comes out. It's a British report that even says, look, a lot of the stuff we said in the heat of things in August 1914, we no longer believe are true. So there's a lot of that going on. What was interesting to me is again, that these American journalists were saying, don't believe any of them. The British are up to their old tricks again, right? We're not going to go to war to save them, right? And we're not going to go to war to save Belgium. We're going to go to war if our interests are threatened. Yes, ma'am.
A mediocre writer to becoming pretty important.
So she's not mediocre. The question is, how did Mary Roberts Reinhardt go from being a mediocre mystery writer to this very famous writer? In her day, she wasn't considered a mediocre writer. So the comparison, or contrast, I guess I'm drawing, when I read Agatha Christie stuff today, it may sound a little aged, maybe a little cliche, but it's still stuff that people make movies out of and TV shows. There's a new Murder on the Orient Express about to come out. It still holds something. Mary Roberts Reinhardt stuff just doesn't. It just doesn't. But she also did all this phenomenal reporting for the Saturday Evening Post that she'd been doing. She did stuff about conditions in mining camps out west, this kind of progressive era kind of journalism. It was great. So she kind of had these two identities. It's just that her identity as a mystery writer, which is probably how she was better known in this time period, just doesn't hold up. The stuff's just not that good. I mean, you can read it for yourself and see if you think it's any better. One of the books I was reading, and I'm like, yeah, I know who did it. I mean, it's not that, really not all that complex. One more question. Yes, sir.
What was the purpose of the German sabotage in the United States?
What's the purpose of German sabotage in the United States? So from the German perspective, the Americans are not neutral at all. If 90% of American goods are going to Great Britain and France, then the United States is no kind of neutral, right? Their contribution is economic, not military, but they're no kind of neutral. So what they're trying to do is destroy the industrial production in places like Pennsylvania so that those artillery shells and bullets and whatever else don't get to Britain, where they're then used to kill Germans. So blowing up this depot in Jersey City, that depot is where all the trains from Pittsburgh, Chicago, Philly, all those munitions things go to Jersey City. They're loaded onto docks and then the ships go from Jersey City. So the thinking is, and this is being done right about the time of the Battle of the Somme, if this is where the weaponry is coming from, if we blow it up, that reduces the number of bullets and shells that can kill Germans. And there are some just phenomenally wonderful spy stories that read like a James Bond thing that are going on in this time period that we know happened. They're not made up. Some of the details vary, but incredible stuff. And it's mostly being done by the New York City Police Department because the U.S. government didn't want to get involved. So the New York City Police Department is the one leading most of this. And they run into all these, it's 1917. There's no law that prohibits Germans from owning dynamite, charts of New York Harbor, and information about where ships are going. There's no law that prevents it. So the New York City Police is saying, guys, we gotta rewrite the laws here. This isn't working. I can't go to New Jersey to investigate this because it's across state lines. Right? So it's crazy stuff, but that's why. The sense is that the United States is not neutral at all, but that we are, there's a French diplomat who called the United States our great neutral ally. So the British and French knew it too. We weren't neutral at all. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation this evening. And behind us is actually the road to war and coming home and all of the different topics that he touched on. And I do want you all to know it was Margaret Dykstra, our head of reference department, that wrote the grant that brought this exhibit here and researched Michael. And if you go to World War I in America, the website upstairs or at home, you'll see many excerpts of Michael on video explaining more, in much more detail, various topics. So we are just very honored because not very many libraries in this country had this opportunity. I also want you to know that upstairs you're able to sign up for those other presentations we talked about. There are refreshments, there's singing in the reading room, and we'll be moving the chairs out from here and pulling these things in so you can see them better, but we'll also bring some refreshments downstairs as well. There is an elevator that way, restrooms in that direction, but the library's not closing at 9, so you're welcome to stay. Thank you all.
Lorra.